Let's do this. The Cult of Hockey podcast by the faithful and for the faithful. I'm David Staples of the Edmonton Journal, and I'm here tonight with special correspondent to the Cult of Hockey, Ira Cooper. Welcome, Ira.
Thanks, David. How are you tonight?
I am fantastic. I played hockey like this early this
Okay.
morning, and I'm a little sore
Is that
still.
is that the first skate of the season for you?
No, we've been playing. We've been playing for a week and a half now.
Okay. Okay.
And I spent the summer rehabbing my knee, but it meant I didn't get any stick and puck and practice. And man, I was handling the puck like a hand grenade today, man. Ooh, it was painful.
Well, Cody Cece is your spirit player. So I hope you haven't switched to Josh Brown. Maybe Ty Emerson will be the
No,
leadoff
I
for you.
think my new spirit oiler will be Ty Emerson. I got maybe Troy Stetcher, although I'm a little taller than Troy Stetcher, so it doesn't really work that way. Yeah, I guess you're an early riser too, Ira, for exercise. You're up 5
What?
a.m. every day, or
It depends on how busy I am at work. So I like to be more six-ish, but some days it's five. Yeah, and get the workout in and listen to some Oilers podcasts and start the day every day.
that's fantastic. So there's some big Oilers news today. Rafael Lavoie is claimed on waivers. The Oilers are going to be setting their roster tomorrow, I think,
Mhm.
and or when and it's going to evolve until Wednesday. But the big thing, and it's been talked about a lot over the summer, but not, I think, fully understood by me and by many fans, is Evander Kane's situation and what his being injured um, in the long term is going to mean for the team. The latest we've heard is 5 to 6 months. 6 months takes you to the end of March and pretty much to the end of the season. It's hard to imagine that if he was out 6 months, that they wouldn't take it to the end of the season for salary cap reasons. But what we're going to do, Ira, is just to go through the cap so people can kind of have a conceptual understanding of the cap and how it works. So my and I'm you are an expert on the cap as fans go. I mean, I don't know if you feel like you could do it professionally, but you have a high degree of knowledge. So that's why we're going to you, because whenever Bruce and I have cap questions, we go to you, Eric,
Yeah, yeah.
because
Well,
you get it right.
I appreciate that. I think that's an aggressive use of the word expert. But I have spent quite a bit of time, reading and trying to understand things, and reach out to people to get clarification on the actual experts that do get paid for it. So I think I could speak to today's matters quite succinctly.
All right. So the cap for the NHL this year per team is $88 million, correct?
Correct.
All right. And that cap, Ira, that $88 million is paid out from the first day of the regular season, which is October 8th,
Mhm.
to the last day of the regular season, April 17th. That's when this $88 million per team that's the period that it's paid out, correct?
Yeah, the amount of days in the regular season changes per year. This year there's 192 days in the regular season,
Okay.
and essentially, go ahead.
So for each day of that 192 days, if you're so each team has a big bowl essentially, and this bowl holds $88 million.
Yeah,
And on the first day of the year, it's empty. But as each day goes into that cap bowl, more and more dollars go in.
yeah,
And once
yeah.
it's filled up to $88 million, that's it. Like you're
You're
generally speaking, you're done.
right. I think the best way to explain it from a high level is that the daily cap hit of a team is calculated every day. So there's 192 days in the season, and you'll take your cap hit of all the players on your roster, and any buried cap hits and all that, and then you divide it by 192, and that's your cap hit for that day, and
Okay,
then it
so if
gets
you're a
added.
if you're an $88 million team, like the Oilers are going to be close to that this year, $88 million. I worked it out. I divided that by 192. You're paying it's roughly $417,000 per day that's
Okay.
being paid out to the players on your roster. So so it's calculated daily. Do you have to be under the cap? Does a team, if it's an $88 million cap team, for
Mhm.
instance, and this is just any team, and so it's paying out this $417,000 per day. Does it have to be under that $417,000 per day each day?
Not necessarily. It's because it's your projected cap hit for the year can't
Yeah,
exceed the $88 million. But as I said, you're only taking 192 of the day, of each day, and you're adding that. And but on any particular day, the way it works is your projected cap space for the rest of the day is if your roster does not change for the end of the till the end of the day. So if you've had a number of days where you're under the cap by say $1 million, you take 192 essentially of that amount, and you could add that and go over the 417,000 for those amount of days. But that would always, but generally speaking, yes,
so
you
if we're
have
talking
to.
about, let's say the cap is again $417,000 a day if you're paying
Yeah.
to the top. So
Mhm.
let's say for a few days you've paid $10,000 under the cap
Mhm.
in terms of salaries to your players. Then your pot is a little, it's not as quite as high. So that gives
Yeah.
you more room in the
Gives you
coming
more.
days then to use that $10,000 per day that you haven't used. So let's
Correct.
say it's 30 days where where you've spent $10,000 or less per day. That would be $300,000 then that you've built up.
Mhm.
It's like space in that pot that you haven't used yet, and you can use that $300,000 down the road,
Correct.
to spend more on players. And
Yeah.
if it's go ahead.
And that's true. And the other thing, and one big caveat to all this, this is when you're not in. I don't want to use the term in LTIR because the Oilers
We'll
get.
get to this
We'll
in a
get to
second.
that, but
We'll
this
get
is
to
in the
this.
normal course.
This is just if you're healthy, raw, you got all
Yeah,
healthy players.
yeah,
I just want like to get a conceptual understanding first of how this works, and then we're going to get into this exception
yeah.
of when
Okay.
players are injured and what happens. All right, so you're let's say so you're under that, and if you were under that, let's say you're spending $10,000 a day less each day, and by the trading deadline, which is 152 days into the season, you would then have accrued about 1.52 million. Like
Mhm.
your pot then it is you've got this 152
Extra
million
space.
less than the maximum, then and you could then spend that on you can trade for a player, and then in the rest of the season you can not only spend the $10,000 a day you weren't spending, but you can spend this extra amount, this extra space in your pot that hasn't been filled with coins yet. You can
Mhm.
now fill up that pot right to the full in the
Correct.
final weeks of the season with a more expensive player.
Right. And additionally to that, that player that you're acquiring mid-season, you're only acquiring what's left on their contract. So
Yes.
I don't know the exact amount of days at the trade deadline, but it's probably about a fifth of the season that's left, maybe a
Yeah,
tiny bit more.
152, and then there's 40 days left.
Yeah. So you're only acquiring 40 days worth of that player's cap hit is all you have to fit in if
Okay.
you're not in LTIR.
Okay. So this is why if you're under the cap at the trade deadline, you have then room to bring in some players who are earning a fair amount of money
Yeah.
because you've built up this deficit in your
Yeah.
cap, and you can then fill that up and use and then go right to the $88 million by the end of the year,
Yeah.
and so okay. What happens then, Ira? Let's say you have Evander Kane. He's earning
Mhm.
5.125 million this year in total, which works out to roughly 26,700 per day. Nice
Mhm.
work if you can get it.
Okay. Yeah.
So what happens with a player gets injured? So he's injured,
Mhm.
um, and he's let's say he's just do the Oilers then, because he can't play, do they get to accrue or use that cap space because he can't play?
No. So whether a player is on the active roster, regular IR, or long-term injury reserve, that player's cap hit will always count. So
Okay,
Kane's 5.125 million, 192nd of it will count and be added to the cap every single day. But
great. Okay,
when
so that's per day, $26,700 for Evander Kane, all every day this year.
every day this year,
That's those coins are going in the Oilers pot. They're filling
yep,
up the Oilers pot.
yep,
There's nothing that stops that.
yep,
Okay.
exactly.
All right. But
So
what why it how does this let's take the next
okay,
step then. Because
all
people
right.
think
So
there's some advantage in this or the
There,
Oilers
there,
can
there
gain
can be.
something from it.
There can be. So
Okay.
I'm just going to get into what they've done today, essentially. So the misconception that's out there a bit today is just because a player is placed on long-term injury reserve, you no longer accrue cap space. That is generally true. When you're in LTIR, generally a team stops accruing the cap space, but that's because they're going over the cap via what's called
Okay, let's
LTIR
talk
reserves.
specifically about Kane. All
Yep,
right. So his situation.
yep,
Let's
yep.
say the Oilers with Kane decide they're going to have this player. He's on long-term injury reserve.
Mm,
That 26,700, let's just say $27,000 a day is going into the pot, filling up the Oilers, using up Oilers cap space.
yep.
That happens no matter what.
That happens. So what
But
what
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 if
they're
they
gonna
decide to not? How can they benefit from this then?
they're gonna put Kane on LTR, and I'm gonna explain.
Okay.
I'm gonna say it'll take a minute, but I'm gonna explain like how it works. So, what they're doing today and tomorrow is setting their LTI reserve pool. When a player goes on LTIR, the first time that happens in a year, that is when you set your reserve pool. And basically, the reserves are what allows you to go over the cap. When people say that LTIR opens up cap space, it's because you can actually go over the $88 million cap. But it's by a
So the
certain.
theory is this: if a player's hurt,
Mhm,
he's significantly injured, and the
mhm,
NHL doesn't want teams to be too hammered by that. So they're
mhm,
thinking someone else can come in, you can
mhm.
bring players in, and you can go over the cap.
Right,
You can bring new
right,
players in that take you over the cap.
right. But the amount that you can go over the cap is set at the time that you're in when you go into LTIR. So it seems like the Oilers are going to put Kane on LTIR the next
Yeah,
couple of days.
yeah.
And the way you can maximize your reserves, the amount you go over, is because the amount of reserves you get is equal to the amount of cap space you have that is deducted from the player's cap hit. So the closer you are, you want to be right up close to the cap, because if the Oilers are going to be $53 away from the cap, we can get into that. But the Oilers are going to be able to go over the cap at any point in the year by 5.125 million minus $53. So
Okay.
that's what they're doing today. That's why they called up Matt Savoy, who's a $900,000 cap hit. That's why they signed Cameron Wright to a $952,000 contract, because it's going to put them right below the cap. They're going to put Kane on LTIR. Then they're going to send those players down probably. So just because Kane's on LTIR does not mean that they can't accrue cap space. You only stop accruing cap space if you're actually over the cap at 88 million by using those LTI reserves. So
So
they're just setting.
just
They're
slow down
they're
for a sec.
just
Slow.
Yeah.
Okay, because I want to make sure I understand this.
Yep.
So if Kane goes on LTIR, IRA,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't
Yep.
bring in new salary,
Correct.
let's say that they don't take that $27,000 a day that he's earning and give it to anyone else. They don't use it.
Yep. Yep.
What happens then? They don't
But
accrue that $27,000 a day,
no,
do they? No,
no, no.
no.
But
They're still that's still going in the. But if they are under the cap
what
with
they're
other
likely going to do
players, with
if
other
they're under the.
players,
Yeah.
then they can build up the money.
Correct. So they're going to be Kane's going to be an LTIR.
Yeah.
But they're going to have, at the time they do that, like $53 in cap space. But they're going to send Matt Savoy down to the minors. That opens up $900,000. They're
Okay.
going to send Cameron Wright down to the minors. That opens up $952,000. Then they're going to probably sign Travis Dermott, and they're probably going to have about $1.2 million like annual cap space. So they'll accrue that and bank it like daily. They'll accrue the 1 out of 192 every day while they're under the cap.
So they do that. So they don't. Kane's money's going into that cap pot.
It's
But
going into
if they're under the cap with other players, like you say, by sending Savoy to the minors, by sending Wright to the minors, and maybe they sign it, they might be like 1,200,000. So it's I'm just going to get out my calculator to figure out what that is per day. But they will then have that extra space in their pot from that, and they even though the Kane's on LTIR, they get to build up this money. When would that change, Ira? Like, would that only change then if they decide to go over the cap to bring in, let's say they want to bring in a high price player early on,
potentially,
and they go over the cap. So how do they start to use Kane's money? Like,
the plan wouldn't be to use Kane's money until they spend the accrued money. So they're in the normal course. They're under the cap by 1.2 million. That's gonna change throughout the year. You know, somebody gets hurt for 10 days. They want to call up Noah Philp. That 1.2 million goes down to about 500,000 for a few days. So they're gonna have some changes in that. But like, let's say the best case scenario is they're under the cap basically all season long until near the deadline. And let's say hypothetically there's no changes to the roster and they're 1.2 million under. That's going to add up to about a $5 to $5.2 million of AAV that they can bring in. So they could spend that money, but that if they happen to go over the cap at any point in between, like you lose that cap space. You lose that accrual. You can't
just wait all of it, or just for that day. All of it?
You lose it at any time that you're over the cap. Like
just wait, but you lose all. Let's say you've been building up. It's about $6,200 a day. You're building it up. Mm-hmm. You're saying if just one day you go over the maximum for the cap per day, that you would lose everything you've built up
while you're still over the cap. You can go into LTIR like over the cap and come back out of it, then you'll continue to accrue. But anytime that you, like, for example, if let's say they have accrued, they've got up, they could acquire a $2 million player come whatever, mid-November. But they also have, and you also think they have Kane's 5.5 million. You don't have both. You have one or the other. If they're 2 million under the cap, they can acquire a 2 million AAV, or they can acquire they can go over the cap by 5 million. They could use that. You lose the accrual. It's not. I don't think I'm explaining it very well.
Well, let me see if I understand this. Okay, so let's go back. They're going to be about $1 million under the cap right now. It looks like. If you look at the cap for the whole year, so that's about $6,200 a day. So as long as this is the situation goes, they're building up $6,200 a day, day after day after day, and then they can use that money, that buildup of money, to sign a more expensive player down the road. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So but if suddenly they decide they're going to bring in a more expensive player. Mm-hmm. And it takes them that the amount of money that they're bringing in takes them over the cap. How first of all, go ahead.
You won't be able to do it in one transaction. So let me explain the best case scenario. Let's say they're $1 million under the cap to start the season. Nothing changes. They're healthy. They're about $1 million under every day up until the trade deadline. That is accrued, and they can acquire an approximately $5 million worth of AAV at the deadline. They make that transaction. They've used all their accrued and banked cap space, but they could still go over the cap by almost 5.125 million. They could make a second trade. They could actually do a 5 plus a 5, but they couldn't do a 10. You know, is what I'm saying. You don't get to do both. And if they used Kane's LTIR space at any time earlier in the year and they're acquiring an expensive player with the $5 million, they can go over the cap. You can't use that accrued cap space. It's one or the other.
Okay,
but you could do it both if you spend your accrued cap space first and then use your LTIR reserves.
So from the Oilers' perspective, the best thing is, well, I mean, let's say Kane it's a bona fide injury. He needs a long time to get healthy.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that they're unlikely to do something until the trade deadline then? Does it make
No,
most sense to wait?
it's tough to say because it really depends on, like, I know Kane's 5 to 6 months, and you're using the long end. If it's 6 months, they could stretch it to 6.5, and he's out for the year. But until they know that and that he's not going to be coming back, I don't think they want to touch the LTIR reserves because, as most people know, if you're over the cap using the LTIR reserves and the player's ready to come back and is coming back, you lose those LTIR reserves. You have to get underneath that 88 million. And if they've spent the money in November, December, February, and Kane is coming back. So I think the plan is to accrue as much as possible and figure out where Kane is as they go along. But they've made moves today to maximize the amount they could go over the cap if they feel they can use that money at some point in time.
Okay, so let's say that they have for 90 days, they're $1 million under the cap,
Yep.
essentially. So they're putting $6,200 a day for 90 days, which times 90, they build up about $560,000 in those 90 days of cap space that they haven't used. So that's what we call accruing, right? This is the money that's accrued. They get that amount of money. So they've got, and then if they bring in a more expensive player, they just have to pay off his more expensive contract for the rest of the year.
Right.
And they have this extra money. They have this extra money to do it. As long as that more expensive player still keeps them under the cap, they can continue. If there's like whatever they're under the cap, they continue to accrue. The second they're over the cap, though, with this new expensive player, what happens the second they're over the cap with this new expensive player? They stop accruing, obviously.
Well, you stop accruing, but they can't go over the amount that player, if that acquisition that you mentioned is it's so expensive that they don't have room, like under their accrued cap space, prorating for what's left in that person's contract, which in your example is just over half of it. They don't have room for that. You take away all, like, they could only do it if they could fit it, if that player,
under the cap
under the LTIR portion. They could acquire, like, if that player is like $6 million, you would have to fit in their entire, because when you're using LTIR and going over the 88 million, you have to fit in the entire annual average value. You don't prorate it to what's left. A $5 million player is a $5 million player at the deadline. He's not a $1 million player. So if they are looking to acquire a $6 million player, they're not going to have room to do that at any point in the year.
So this is the two-player thing you're talking about. So it makes sense for them to think about bringing in two players, because for the first player, you don't go over the cap. You use all the accrued space that you have to acquire that first player. Then the second player, you're thinking, okay, we're right up against the cap now. We've used all our accrued space. We still have Evander Kane, though. And at this point, we think he's going to be out the rest of the year.
Then you got $5 million.
Then you can say, okay, we've built up, used the accrued space. And then if Kane is out the rest of the year, you can use his cap hit to bring in another player. If he's not out the rest of the year, you've been paying it all along, his cap hit anyway. He just comes back on the roster and you just keep paying him as usual.
100%.
I think we've reached some clarity. I think I've reached some clarity here, Ira, in terms of how this works. So it's so the second, I see. Can you in the same transaction, could they, let's say they like bring in like a player who's going to take all of Kane's cap hit early on. That would be them essentially announcing that they don't expect Kane's coming back for the year.
But they're done.
And they can't use their accrued. You're not allowed to use your accrued space in that moment to bring in that player.
No, because at the what you mentioned, they haven't accrued enough money to fit that player in, so they're
Correct.
using their LTI reserves and going
Yes.
over the cap.
Yeah.
So that there's no more accrual at that point, and basically they can their new cap hit is essentially what's 88 plus 5, 90, 93 and a bit, and that player is probably going to take up most of it, right? So they might
Okay.
have a little bit of wiggle. Like think back to the Clefbaum days, your money in, money out in that state. Like you
Yeah.
have your $93 million. You're probably 92 something with this big acquisition that they made in November, but you're not gaining anything at all. You're at that cap hit for the rest of the year. If they wanted to make another acquisition, similar to how they moved out Tyson Berry in the Ekholm, like because they're money in, money out at that point.
So with injured players, their money's always just being paid into the
Yeah,
cap pot.
you'll
And
talk about
the only thing is it leads to this option, this kind of LTIR option, where if you're convinced this player isn't coming back or is going to be out for a long time, um, you can use it's kind of an unusual situation almost where you would use the LTIR option to because that most players are coming back then and then you're kind of screwed, aren't
generally.
you?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it's only when this LTIR option is used, it's only really when there's these season long injuries, generally speaking, and
Or
and
you're
or
just
multiple players are getting going on and off LTIR.
that's another possibility. Like maybe, they've spent a bunch of money and, Kane's going to come back in February, March, whenever it happens to be. Oh, magically Adam Henrique gets hurt. There's, $3 million that you only have to clear 2 million now because Henrique's on LTIR, for example. But then you can't activate him. Like it's not a great scenario, but you can have. I know you've talked about it on previous pods, like rotating LTIRs and with
Yes,
the Oilers' average age being about the same as me and you, maybe it's a bit of a possibility.
it's a
So,
possibility.
but
All right.
the misconception out there is like putting a player on LTR gives you cap relief. It does, but it doesn't take their cap hit's gone. The cap hit is never gone. It's always on the roster, but is some ability to go over the cap by the amount of their cap hit, less like generally. But you don't accrue space. You can't prorate players, as we just discussed. So the
Do
cap
you
hit never disappears.
do you take the Oilers' move as any kind of indication at all of how long they think Kane will be out or not?
No, I think it's for flexibility because, as I said, it's at the time the player goes into LTIR that you set where you figure out where your cap is and you can figure out how much you go over. So if they didn't do this today and then they realize that come November or December, more players are hurt and they're going to need to go into LTIR just to field a team, they don't want to have to set their LTIR pool then and make all these roster moves because you won't be able to get to the $53 under the cap. Today is the day where you could do that because you got players like Cameron Wright on the roster, who's never going to actually be on the roster during the season.
So let's talk about what happened today. Now that
Yeah.
and I'm hoping most people listening to this will have a slightly better grasp of how the cap mechanics work. So
Mm-hmm.
now they can kind of figure out maybe what happened today. So what
Mm-hmm.
happens today is they sign Cameron Wright, and they call up Matt Savoy, who's got bonuses. So
Mm-hmm.
what is and then they sign Cameron Wright to a specific fairly high
Yeah.
contract for
Yeah.
a rookie NHLer.
Yeah.
What were they hoping to achieve? What are they trying to do here,
For
Ira?
I'm going to take
Let's
one
do
step
one at a
back.
time. Go ahead.
I'm gonna do something additional and pat myself on the back yesterday because I think it was only 2 days ago where I put out there on the internet that Cameron Wright's earning himself an NHL contract in real time because I watched the Condors and he was a revelation last year and that start so he's earned a contract. He's not going to be on the team this year, but so what they did today is, as I kind of said at the beginning, when you're setting your LTIR reserve pool, and there's a salary pool and a bonus pool, I'll get into that in a bit. But for the salary pool, which is basically the amount of AAV that you can go over the cap,
Yeah,
the amount you can go over is the amount the cap hit of the player that's going on LTIR, Evander
yeah,
Kane,
yeah.
less the amount of cap space you have. So you want to be the
Per day.
closest to
Per
no
his
no no
per
no
day
no
salary or for the
don't
whole year?
don't talk. When you're an LTIR, there is no more per day.
Okay.
There's-
All right.
so it's 5.125 million less the amount of cap space. So you want to get as close to 88 million as a projected cap hit as you can when you're putting the player on LTIR.
So if the Oilers were
Because
only at an $86 million cap, that means they would have, which is $2 million under the cap, they would
yeah,
subtract $2 million from Kane's salary. And
no,
that's
no,
how
no, no, no,
much,
no.
that's how much that's how
That
much room they would have to sign a
no.
player.
So the if the Oilers were $2 million under the cap when they put Kane on LTIR, they would only be able to go over the cap by 3.125 million,
That's
as
what I was
opposed
trying
to
to say.
five. But yeah, in a different way. So
Okay.
so
Yeah.
so you're right. So they wanted to get as close to the cap as possible. So they added Matthew Savoy to the roster at 900,000, and that's why Cameron Wright got a $952,000 contract, which isn't even something they offered like Dylan Holloway on a one-way
Yeah.
deal. Because like he's never going to actually be on the roster this year,
Yeah.
so it doesn't matter.
Except on that day that they put Kane on LTIR. That's
The
the only
one day,
day.
but they signed him to that because that took them to within $53 of the cap. So the amount that they can go over the cap, if they ever choose to use the LTIR reserves, is 5.125 million minus $53.
Okay. I think I
So
get that as well.
okay,
All right,
and
Ira, you can send us your bill for this
you know, I'm not gonna tell you what my hourly
what your
rate is.
hourly rate is.
But one more thing I want to talk about is
Go ahead.
specifically with respect to Matthew Savoy.
Okay.
So the reason that it was Matthew Savoy that was called up and put on the roster, and again, this is only when a team is using LTIR reserves and are over the cap. Any
Yeah.
player that has performance bonuses in their contract, which are only entry level contract players that could have them, and players over the age of 35, like Corey Perry has some performance bonuses, and Matthew Savoy. If they are not on the roster when when you go into LTIR and are setting these pools, then their bonus money will count as part of their cap if they're called up and in the LTR. It's because you have to set the salary pool, which is what I just talked about,
Yeah.
and then there's also a bonus pool. So if Matthew Savoy wasn't on the roster, they don't have a bonus pool, but now they've set $1 million bonus pool plus Corey Perry, and I think his bonuses are 300,000 or 400,000. So they have
Yeah.
that bonus pool money, so that if Matthew Savoy is called up during the year, and if he's called up and they're accruing cap space under the cap, it would never matter. But if they call
Yeah.
him up and they happen to have a bunch of injuries and they're using the LTIR space, then if they didn't have him on the roster today, he would be a $1.9 million cap hit. It's a bit
Yeah.
less. But
Yeah.
now he'll only be an 867,000 or whatever it is if they call him up during LTIR. So that's one specific reason why
And
Matthew
his
Savoy
and his
was.
and if he got his bonuses, they wouldn't be paid off the team's cap this year, but next year.
The boat. First of all, Matthew Savoy is not going to hit any of his bonuses.
I know.
They're literally things like 30 goals and
Yeah.
like winning awards and stuff
Yeah.
so top two in the team in scoring and stuff. So if he does like get called up or any hits, like great. but like it doesn't matter. So if he hits any of his bonuses, and they're $250,000 each. Let's
Yeah.
say he hits all four. You
Yeah.
add that $1 million to their cap hit at the end of the season. And
Yeah.
if you can't fit that into your 88 million, it's
Yeah.
gonna hit the cap next year. Just
I
like
see.
Connor Brown's did. Like just because they set the bonus pool today, that doesn't affect the fact that they'll be added. If they're vested, they get added. But I don't think if we have to worry about that with Matthew Savoy,
That's a good thing.
Good thing.
All right. All right. Let's just talk some hockey just for a bit here.
Yeah, sure.
What do you think of the team that was assembled this summer? The one major difference is Troy Stetcher essentially leapfrogged over Josh Brown, and it looks like Travis Dermott has done that. Noah Philp is getting rave reviews, but it looks like they want him to play more minutes for the time being in Bakersfield. I mean, I was listening to Stan Bowman on Oilers now tonight, and that seems to be the philosophy, which even though I think Philp on merit could easily have made the team, I don't disagree with that idea of playing him for a month or two down there, and like injuries are going to happen, and he'll be the first call
Yeah.
up. But what do you
And
think? What do you think of these roster moves yourselves? What's your
yeah,
take?
to it was the reasonable path forward. I know that a lot of Oilers fans are going to throw a lot of criticism because they lost Raphael Lavoie, a player with upside and potential, and have kept 39-year-old Corey, soon to be 40-year-old Corey Perry, and 36, 37 Derek Ryan, and they think those guys should have been with. But it was, I don't necessarily disagree. I was never really on board with the Perry signing, but he wasn't going to be waived at the beginning of the year, and nor was Derek Ryan. And anything they did in preseason means nothing to me because what veterans do in preseason means absolutely nothing. What Noah Philp did was show that he can very likely play in this league because he hasn't proved he can play in this league. He can't do
No.
that in exhibition. He can only do that in regular season, but he's proved that he's earned the opportunity. And I'm going to pat myself on the back for Noah Philp as well. I wrote the Colts prospect report on him, and I've been a big fan of him since basically the spring or the February of 2022. So Philp will be back at some point. Like players are going to get hurt. He's going to get called up. It's going to take their cap accrual down during the time when they actually have 23 players on the roster. Um, I'm not enthused with the fourth line, but I think Ryan and Perry do have something to give. They can't play every night, so they are going to have to bring a guy like Philp up and down. They lost a little bit of depth in Lavoie long term, but at the same time, the guy's 24 years old. He's played 7 games. He's got 0 NHL points, and I'm not so sure that he's not going to be waived tomorrow. Even Stauffer alluded to it as well because
What do you
let's
think
not
of him as a
forget.
player? Be honest, just
You
honest
know, you
take
know
here.
what? When he was on waivers last year, he cleared. He went to the AHL for the first 7 and 8 games last year. He was an absolute beast. He was bullying the AHL. Every shift, he was dominating the puck. He was taking it to the net. He was scoring goals. He may have been. I don't watch all the games, but he was one of the best players in the American Hockey League until his call up to the NHL. He got recalled. He got his 6 7 minutes. He didn't really impact the game that much. When he got sent back down to the AHL last year, he was not that same player. Like he was still good. He scored 28 goals, but most of them were on power play. He was relying on power play. He wasn't dynamic consistently at even strength. He could still make plays and he would still, win board battles, but he didn't have the fire that he had at the beginning of last season. And this consistency, this inability to, you know, give that 100% shift after shift and play that game has plagued him since junior, and I've watched his entire AHL career. So he's got the skills. I'm not sure he has the consistency. I don't know what's going to happen in Vegas, but I do not think that they thought they were going to get 2 players off waivers, and I don't think they're going to be keeping them both. Like Lavoie could be back on waivers tomorrow.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've only seen him in brief spurts. I haven't seen him that much. And what I saw, like, I was back in COVID when he was playing in Sweden, and you could see he he has a special talent. Like when he makes up his mind to take the puck to the net
Yeah,
and fire that puck, shoot the puck, score the puck. That's a really intriguing player. That's a really interesting player.
yeah,
But the consistent report I've had from people who keep a close eye on Bakersfield is that he hasn't been consistent, that he hasn't been strong on defense, that he just hasn't brought that intensity. I
mm-hmm.
thought this was his best training camp with the Oilers, and we saw some of that ability to score. But he is 24, as you say, and like in a way it would be a blessing to him to go to another NHL team. He didn't get picked up on waivers last year, and just give him that chance.
Yep,
Let's see what he can
yep,
do. For him, the Oilers have, even if he got put back on waivers, I wonder if the Oilers would take him.
yep. Oh,
Like
I think so. Oh,
you
100%.
do.
Yeah.
Oh, probably they
Um,
would.
so
Yeah,
first of all,
why not?
there is also a misconception that the Oilers have a ROFR, a right of first refusal, if he goes back on waivers. If he goes back on waivers, it's the same. Oilers are not first; they're wherever they are in the claim order,
Oh,
24th or
that's
25th.
interesting. Is that
That's true.
okay?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So that is a misconception.
yeah.
But also, let's remember, like that same order, 18 teams just passed on him to Vegas.
Yeah.
So And when you get past Vegas, you get to the better teams that probably aren't keeping a Ralph Lavoie on their roster. So there's a very good chance that if he does get waived again, the Oilers will. I'm almost positive they put in a claim, and they probably get him. And if they are the only team that made a claim, which is likely the case, they can then put him in Bakersfield.
All righty.
So, but to that, I do want to talk about, because I was pretty negative in my review, and that probably isn't fair to the player, because he is a good hockey player, and that one skill that you mentioned, his shot, like it really is elite. Like he can score goals out of nothing, because he's got a very quick release, and he can get his shot off from various different shooting angles, like puck placements and different angles. Like the goal he scored, the winning goal in 3 or 4. I think it was the only game the Oilers won in,
Yeah.
in the exhibition. He scored with 3 or 4 minutes left. Like he got a little bit of space, but he shot it from some weird angle. And not many people can get a shot in that area with that accuracy, with that release, and you can beat NHL goalies. So if he gets a real chance with Vegas and gets to play, like he can generate some goals from the bottom six. I do think. I'm not sure if he can help outscore, because I'm not sure he's a great two-way player, but he'll be able to generate.
Yeah, the point you made about Perry, I'm not on team Corey Perry. Like he didn't, to me, come through in the playoffs.
Yeah.
Didn't even really come that close to coming through. And I just wonder, I didn't understand why they brought him back.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know the internal dynamics in terms of the leadership group on the team. Maybe he's just absolutely crucial to that, because he can still play a bit. I'm just wasn't. And if Holloway and Broberg, if the offer sheets hadn't happened, I don't see how Perry would have been in the top 12. I think
Yeah.
Derek Ryan, because he's a viable penalty killer. They've lost they've lost two key players in Fogle and McLeod, and then CC and Doharney. So four key
Yeah.
players off their kill. I think Ryan is useful for that. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's a big part of hockey. You can get a goal scored on you very quickly on the penalty kill.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I think Derek Ryan has a bit more to give, but I will not be surprised in the least to see Philp supplant one of
Yeah.
those two players as the year goes on. Like I
I
think
said
that very likely to happen.
I said Philp was going to supplant Ryan 18 months ago, so I'm ahead of the game on that. And I agree 100% on Perry. He was ineffective, if not a liability, in the playoffs, on the ice at least. He did
Some
score.
okay games, but
I,
yeah.
I think he had something like, it was 12 or 14 goals in like 56 games last year. So he was still able to score. And I would have been okay bringing him back at league minimum. I don't know why he needed to get 1.125 million, which, by the way, is at the very limit that can be fully buried in the AHL. So I don't think it's a coincidence that he's right at, like, if they
Yeah.
do waive him and send him down, his cap hit's gone completely. But so I didn't really want to bring him back, but I do think he's important in the leadership. I think he takes a lot of pressure off McDavid a bit. When things in the playoff and there was hard times, you always saw, Corey Perry consoling people and basically taking some of that McDavid load off. And Perry consoling McDavid as well,
Yeah.
and keeping his spirits up. So I don't know what he does in the dressing room necessarily, but I think he's got a voice, and I think it's strong, and I think he uses it. I'm not saying it's worth 1.125 million and losing Lavoie, because of his on ice impact, but I think there's something there off ice that us fans may
Yeah.
not.
I don't know if
Never,
Love yeah, would Lavoie be better than Perry? I have no idea. And Perry's not a terrible player. He's just okay-ish, like
yeah, yeah,
mediocre at this point in
yeah.
his career. So
He scored that lovely exhibition goal, and you see beautiful
I
hands.
did. That was nice. He can still do that.
He was going the same speed as you skate, I think. So
No. All right, Ira. I know you got stuff to do tonight, so I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and talking, and thanks for clarifying salary cap matters
yeah,
over the years. And I hope this podcast was helpful to some people
yeah.
in getting how this whole thing works.
Yeah, and if anybody does have, like, I'm not the expert. There's people that know better than me, but I do think I have some knowledge, and feel free to reach out to me on X, I guess it is. I think it's Coopsy39 is my handle, and I'm happy to always answer any questions to the best of my ability.
That's a kind offer. Thanks again, Ira. Thanks for talking
Yeah.
tonight.
Thanks, David.
And in the meantime, and in between times, this has been another edition of the Cult of Hockey podcast.